Here are creatures in Bloodborne that most players never stop to fully consider, and once you do, the game stops feeling like a horror game and starts feeling like something closer to a document. If you have spent any real time with Bloodborne, you have probably noticed that its enemies are not random. They are not the generic assortment of monsters that populate most games in the genre. Each one feels like it was placed there because of what it means, not just because of what it does to your health bar, and the longer you sit with that feeling, the more it becomes clear that the designers were doing something deliberate that goes well beyond visual design. This script exists because I wanted to spend real time with that question. I wanted to look at the creatures of Yharnam not as obstacles or encounter design, but as text, as things the game is trying to say through form and behaviour and placement. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button, so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. There is a lot of ground to cover here, and I want to be upfront about how I chose to organise it. I made a deliberate decision when building this script to leave out the bosses. Not because they are uninteresting, but because they have been covered extensively, and because the regular creatures, the ones you pass on your way somewhere else, are far more philosophically strange than they are usually given credit for. What I wanted to find was the strangeness in the things that get treated as background noise. That is what this script is actually about. The city of Yharnam is, before it is anything else, a place that used to be something else. You can feel that in the architecture, in the way certain streets give way to older streets below them, in the way certain enemies seem to belong to different eras of the same catastrophe. The Yharnamites you encounter in the early hours of the game are not monsters in the way a skeleton or a zombie is a monster. They are people who have undergone something, and the game is deliberate about making you feel that. They carry torches and weapons, and they form groups. They have intentions, even if those intentions have been warped into something that no longer serves any recognisable social purpose. The Yharnamites in the streets outside Iosefka's clinic are the first thing the game asks you to look at, and they are also, in retrospect, among the most carefully constructed. A mob of torch-bearing Yharnamites reads, on the surface, like a crowd of angry villagers. It is a familiar horror image. But what separates the Yharnamites from that image is the specificity of their degradation. They are not unified. They are not moving toward a single goal. Some stand apart and murmur to themselves. Some have turned on each other. One will be facing a wall, motionless, for no discernible reason. The game never explains these behaviours, and I think that is the correct choice, because the explanation would flatten something that works precisely because it is unresolved. The Yharnamites in the street suggest that the hunt does not produce uniform madness. It produces individual madness that looks like collective madness from a distance. That distinction points towards something important about how the game understands the plague. Some people have been more deeply touched than others. Some are still operating with the remnants of social logic, gathering in groups, making decisions, performing the structure of community, even when the content of that community has become incoherent. Others have moved past even that residual structure and are simply present, alone in their madness, doing something that bears no relationship to any collective project. The scourge of the beast is the affliction that has overtaken Yharnam, and it is worth spending a moment on what that affliction actually does before looking at the creatures it produces. The scourge does not appear to transform people all at once or in identical ways. What it seems to do, based on the evidence spread across item descriptions and environmental storytelling, is accelerate whatever is already present in a person, including their biology, their fear, their violence, and their capacity for transformation. The result is that the people of Yharnam are not changed into the same thing. They are each changed into a more extreme version of something that was already there. This is one possible reading of the creature variety in Bloodborne, and it is worth holding on to as a framework for what follows. If the scourge amplifies rather than replaces, then what you see in the streets of Yharnam is not a uniform catastrophe, but a personalised one. A catastrophe that takes each person and makes them more of themselves in the worst possible direction. The aggressive man becomes the beast. The fearful man becomes the thing that hides in corners and flinches. The pious man becomes something still performing devotion in a form that no longer corresponds to any recognisable theology. The scourge in this reading is a mirror that only shows you your worst self, and then it keeps showing you that until the mirror is all there is. The brick trolls, those enormous, slow, hulking enemies who patrol certain streets and sewers, are among the easiest enemies in the game to overlook as lore objects. They hit hard, they move slowly, they are not subtle. But look at their design for a moment. They are not simply large. Their posture has collapsed inward. Their proportions have become extreme in ways that suggest the body outpacing any structure designed to hold it, and there is something in the way they move that is not aggressive so much as burdened. They do not seem to want to attack you. They seem to be carrying something they cannot put down. A number of players have noted that the brick trolls appear to be wearing or fused with work clothing, which suggests that whatever they were before the scourge took them, they were labourers. They are, in that reading, the working class of Yharnam, made monstrous by the same plague that the elites of the city were using to distinguish themselves. The positioning of the brick trolls matters enormously in this context. They appear in the most run-down and working areas of the city. They are not found in the places where the wealthy Yharnamites gather. They are in the streets and the sewers, which is where the poor parts of Yharnam are located if you read the environmental design carefully. There is no item description that says this directly, but the placement is not accidental. Bloodborne is a game that was made by people who think about where they put things, and putting the most physically transformed and least cognitively present of the early game enemies in the lower quarters of a stratified city points towards something about who the scourge of the beast costs most. The poor of Yharnam were probably the first to receive untested blood ministries. They were probably the least able to refuse. They were probably the least able to leave the city when things went wrong. And they are, as brick trolls, the furthest from human form of any enemy in the early game. That quiet detail is easy to walk past. It is worth stopping for. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the huntsmen and notice that they have not all lost their speech. Some of the Yharnamite enemies in the early game still talk. They say things. They call for the blood. They warn you away. They accuse you. The fact that some of them retain language while others have lost it entirely is not a binary line between the infected and the uninfected. It suggests that the scourge operates along a spectrum, that some Yharnamites are further along than others, and that the ones who still talk are in a kind of middle state that is, if you think about it, more disturbing than the ones who have gone fully silent. The ones who can still speak know, on some level, what is happening to them. What the huntsmen are saying, under all the aggression, may be a form of communication that has been so thoroughly distorted by the affliction that it no longer serves its original function, but the structure of speech is still there. That is where the real horror lives. Not in the silence, but in what tries to fill it. A huntsman who calls for the blood is performing a ritual without understanding the ritual. He has retained the vocabulary of a belief system and lost the belief. He is shouting liturgy at someone he is about to attack with a pitchfork, and the dissonance between those two things is the most succinct description of what Yharnam is in the opening hours. The Hemwick Charnel Lane is a location that does not get discussed as often as the Cathedral Ward or Old Yharnam, but the enemies that populate it are among the most thematically specific in the game. The grave women are pale, gaunt enemies who move with an unsettling looseness, dressed in the garb of those who tend to the dead. They are not huntsmen. They are something adjacent to the work they did in life, which is to say they are people whose relationship to death has been so intensified by the scourge that they have crossed into a state where the distinction between tending to the dead and becoming something like the dead has collapsed. The grave women point toward a reading of the scourge as something that takes the central preoccupation of a person's life and amplifies it past the point where that preoccupation can remain human. If this reading is correct, then the grave women were once genuinely engaged in the work of burying the dead, of maintaining the rituals that separate the living from what comes after. The scourge took that engagement and made it total, made it consuming, made it the only thing left. The result is a creature that is still doing the work, but has ceased to be a person who does work. And that particular kind of loss, the loss of the person that remains when only the function survives, is one that Bloodborne returns to repeatedly. The invisible hands in Hemwick, those grasping presences that appear when the witches of Hemwick summon them, suggest something about how the scourge interacts with people who were already practicing something occult before it arrived. The invisible hands in particular are disturbing because they do not look like anything. They are not a recognizable, transformed body. They are something that has lost its form entirely and retained only its function, which is to grab. Whether the hands were once full people, or parts of people, or something the witches created from the scourge rather than succumb to it, is left genuinely open. The pigs are worth stopping on. The diseased pigs in the cathedral ward and the sewers below it are not, on the surface, complicated. They are large, hostile animals. But they are animals that have been affected by the scourge, which means they are showing us what the transformation looks like when it has no human psychology to work through. The pigs are enormous, and they are aggressive, and they are clearly suffering. And that combination produces something that is more like a natural disaster than an enemy. You do not feel like you are fighting something that wants to hurt you. You feel like you are in the path of something that is in agony and cannot locate the source of that agony. The sewers where the pigs live are littered with the remains of Yharnamites, which suggests that the pigs have been there for a while and that no one has come to address this. That quiet detail tells you something about how far the situation in Yharnam has deteriorated before you arrive. The city is not responding to its sewers anymore. The civic infrastructure of dealing with problems in the subterranean parts of the city has simply ceased to function, and the pigs are the evidence of that cessation. They have been down there, eating what falls, getting bigger, getting worse, and nobody above them has had the capacity to do anything about it. The Murgo's attendants, those small masked figures that appear in the Nightmare of Mensis, are disturbing in a specific way that connects them to the game's interest in what care looks like when the thing being cared for is no longer something that should be cared for. The attendants are servants. They serve Murgo. They wear the garb of domestic service, and they move with the purposefulness of people who have a job to do. The horror of the attendants is not that they are monstrous in appearance, though they have their own strangeness, but that they are performing the functions of care in a space that has long since become incoherent. They are attendants in a nightmare. That describes a specific kind of commitment to function, in the absence of any context that could make the function meaningful. Another quiet detail appears when you look at Yhargul's architecture and notice that the building contains evidence of multiple periods of inhabitation. Yhargul did not become what it is overnight. The School of Mensis was operating there for a very long time before the events of the game, and the accumulated evidence of their operations, the cells, the ritual spaces, the bodies in various states of experiment, all of this suggests a horror that is as much about duration as about transformation. The creatures of Yhargul are disturbing, not just because of what they are, but because of how long whatever produced them has been producing them. The celestial minions that appear in certain endgame areas are among the most formally alien creatures in the game. They are small, pale, with limbs that are too many or too arranged. And they move with an uncanny fluency that is specifically wrong rather than generically strange. The celestial minions are not beasts. They are not afflicted in the way the Yharnamites are afflicted. They are something that is being drawn toward a different category of existence entirely, one that the game associates with the Great Ones and with the kind of ascension that Bloodborne treats as deeply ambiguous. Whether what is happening to the celestial minions is advancement or degradation is left genuinely open. The shadows of Yharnam are enemies that appear as guardians of a particular threshold in the game, and they are interesting because they represent a version of transformation that is specifically about service. The shadows serve the Queen. Whatever they were before, whatever transformation they have undergone, they retain a function and a loyalty that has survived their change. This makes them unlike the beasts who have lost their social function, and unlike the celestial minions who seem to be moving towards something rather than serving something. The shadows suggest that transformation does not always dissolve purpose. It can also intensify it, burning away everything except the function that has been preserved. The history of Yharnam before the Scourge is not something you can read about in any single item description. It is assembled from fragments, from the way certain buildings are positioned relative to others, from the kind of work certain characters were doing before the game's opening night began, from the implications of who is where and why they are still there. Yharnam was a city that believed it had solved something. It had a medical tradition built on blood, and that tradition had attracted pilgrims from across the world for generations. The city's confidence in itself was architectural. You can see it in the size of the healing church structures, in the scale of the cathedral ward, in the way the city was built to be impressive to people who came to it for help. The blood ministry that the healing church practiced was not simply a medical service, it was a theology. The church believed that the blood it administered was sacred, that its healing properties were connected to something divine, or at least beyond ordinary comprehension, and that belief shaped how the church treated both the blood and the people it administered it to. The patients who came to Yharnam for treatment were not just sick people looking for a cure. They were, in the church's framework, participants in something. What they were participating in was not clearly communicated to them, and the creatures that populate the city are in part the result of that communicative failure. The role of the healing church in the proliferation of the Scourge is one of the game's most carefully maintained ambiguities. The church was not simply evil, it was not simply negligent. It was an institution that had access to something genuinely powerful, that used that power to help people, and that failed to fully account for the costs of the power it was distributing. The creatures the church's failures produced are spread across the entire game, from the beasts in the street, to the entities in the upper cathedral, to the nightmares trapped hunters, and what connects all of them is not malice, but the consequence of insufficient understanding combined with significant ambition. The amygdala that you can see on the rooftops of the cathedral ward, if you have enough insight, is worth spending a moment with as a framing device for everything that follows. The amygdala is enormous. It is clearly not hiding. It is simply in a register of reality that most people cannot access without first accumulating a certain amount of terrible knowledge. This is one of Bloodborne's central ideas rendered in creature design. The world is full of things that are present but imperceptible to those without the capacity to see them. The horror is not that it arrived. The horror is that it was always there, that a city of people went about their lives in its shadow and never knew it. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the infected corpse enemies in the sewers and notice that they are reanimated but not transformed in the beast direction. These are not people who are becoming animals. These are people who have died and been animated by something that is not quite life. The distinction matters because it suggests that the scourge of the beast and the cosmic influence of the Great Ones operate through different mechanisms that can produce similar visual results. The infected corpses are simply dead and moving, which is its own kind of wrongness. One that the game places carefully alongside the beast transformations, so that you begin to understand that Yharnam is afflicted in more than one way. The pacing of creature introduction in Bloodborne is worth pausing on, because it is part of how the game makes its argument. You encounter the huntsman first, then the large huntsman, then the more transformed beasts, then the things that are not really classifiable as either human or beast. This progression is not accidental. It is a tutorial in reading transformation, a series of lessons in what the Scourge does at different stages, delivered through the actual enemies rather than through any text. By the time you encounter something that has no human component left, you have been educated about what the human component was and what its loss means. The game teaches you to read what you are looking at before it shows you the things that are hardest to look at. The church giants serve the church with a methodical deliberateness that distinguishes them from all of the Scourge-afflicted enemies around them. They are enormous, and they are connected to official Yharnam in ways that suggest they are not simply afflicted patients. They represent what happens when an institution uses the very thing it is supposed to be managing as a tool for maintaining authority. The church knew about the Scourge. The church was, in some sense, the reason the Scourge was possible. The giants in the service of that institution suggest that the boundary between the institution and the affliction was never as clean as the church presented it. The giants are the most visible symbol of that. What the opening section of Yharnam is really doing, taken as a whole, is introducing you to a city that is at different points in the same catastrophe simultaneously. The brick trolls represent an advanced stage. The huntsmen with their torches represent a middle stage. The ones who are still mostly human but acting wrongly represent an early stage. And certain figures, Gascoigne's family for instance, represent the moment of transition. All of these stages are present at once, in the same streets, because the catastrophe has not progressed uniformly. It has moved through the city in uneven waves, touching some people faster than others, leaving pockets of relatively intact humanity next to fully transformed monstrosities. This unevenness is not a design flaw. It is an argument about how catastrophes actually work, spreading through communities along the lines of who has access to what and who does not. The way the early game enemies behave when you are not engaging them directly is as important as how they behave when you are. The huntsmen who patrol without noticing you are doing something. They are moving through a routine, or the remnant of a routine, performing actions that once had social meaning. The ones who gather around fires are doing something communal that no longer serves any apparent social function, but has not yet been abandoned. The ones who sit alone are somewhere past the communal stage entirely. Bloodborne communicates its world building through behaviour as much as through design, and the behaviour of enemies who are not currently trying to kill you is where a significant portion of that communication happens. The Yahar'gul hunters present in the unseen village are distinct from the hunter enemies you encounter elsewhere, because they are not simply hunters who have been transformed. They are hunters who have been gathered. Someone or something has been collecting them, bringing them to this place, maintaining them here. The Yahar'gul hunter enemies are evidence of an institutional project, of someone with the capacity to gather hunters and a reason to do so. The school of Mensis needed people for their rituals. The hunters they gathered are still there, still operating in a diminished and distorted form, still serving a function they may no longer understand in a project that has long since passed beyond anyone's control. The cramped casket enemies in Yharnam are among the most formally strange things in the game. They are people, apparently still mostly human, who have been sealed inside iron coffins and are attacking you from inside those coffins. The caskets are their weapon and their prison simultaneously. One possible reading is that they represent what happens to people who try to resist or contain the affliction through literal physical constraint, not on others but on themselves, and were then swept up into the hunt regardless. The cramped caskets point toward a Yharnam in which the options available to people were so limited that self-imprisonment seemed like a rational response. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the brain of Mensis from the first time you encounter its effects, before you can see it, and notice that the danger it presents is entirely epistemic. The brain of Mensis is not threatening you physically at a distance. It is threatening your ability to perceive, your accumulated insight, your capacity to understand what is happening around you. The game establishes this as a property of certain cosmic entities very early in the Mensis section, which is important because it changes the nature of the danger you are navigating. You are not just walking through a dangerous area. You are walking through an area where the danger includes the possibility of understanding less than you did when you entered, and that specific category of threat, the threat to comprehension rather than to the body, is one that Bloodborne introduces through its creatures before it introduces it through any explicit narrative explanation. The history of Yharnam's founding, as much as can be assembled from what the game provides, suggests that the city's relationship to the deep structures below it was part of its original character rather than something that developed over time. The Chalice dungeons below Yharnam are not an accident of geology. They are the ruins of something that preceded the city, and the people who built Yharnam built it at least partly because of what was below it, because of what could be accessed from below it, because of what the ruins contained. The creatures in those ruins are not invaders from outside the world the game is set in. They are native to the world, to its oldest layers, and Yharnam is a city that grew up above something it was always going to eventually fall into. The opening of Bloodborne places you in a medical clinic, being given a transfusion, and the first thing you do after receiving that transfusion is encounter a monster. This sequencing is not incidental. It is the game's argument about the relationship between the cure and the disease in Yharnam, compressed into the first 5 minutes of play. You receive the blood. You encounter the beast. The causal chain is established in the player's body before it is established in the player's understanding. By the time you understand intellectually what the scourge of the beast is and where it comes from, you have already participated in the process that creates it. The creatures you will spend the rest of the game fighting are, in a meaningful sense, the result of what was done to you at the start. That makes your relationship to them something other than simple adversarial. It makes you continuous with them. The cleric beast appears at the end of the first significant stretch of the game, and what it does architecturally is mark a threshold. You have now seen what the scourge produces when it has had enough time and space to fully express itself. But the cleric beast is not the end of the argument. It is the first clear statement of it. The game saying plainly, here is what happens to a clergyman in Yharnam. Here is where the theology of blood ends up, when the blood is drawn from something that cannot be safely contained. Every subsequent creature in the game is a variation on that statement, and the variation is the point. The cleric beast is the argument in its simplest form. The rest of the game is the argument in all its complexity. Chapter 2. The Beasts of Yharnam's Streets. The transformation from human to beast in Bloodborne is not, the evidence suggests, a sudden event. It is a process, and the game is careful to show you different stages of that process without ever organising them into a tidy progression. What you encounter in the streets of Yharnam is not a clear hierarchy of transformation, but something messier and more disturbing. A population in the middle of becoming something else, at different rates and in different ways, without any apparent mechanism for stopping. The smaller, faster beast forms that patrol the upper city do not move like animals. They move like people who have forgotten they are people, which is a different thing. An animal moves with the coherence of its instincts. These things move with the incoherence of instincts that are fighting something else for control of the same body. The way they pause, the way they flinch, the way they sometimes seem to be reacting to something that is not there, points toward a creature that is in conflict with itself in a way that no natural animal would be. They are not yet beasts. They are not any more humans. They are the space between those two categories. And that space is the specific territory Bloodborne is most interested in. The large huntsman enemies, the ones who are further along in the transformation than the torch-bearing mobs, are notable because they still carry weapons. They are not using those weapons intelligently, but they are carrying them, which suggests that some mechanical memory of the hunt persists even as the capacity for reasoning about the hunt is lost. The large huntsman is a creature that remembers what it was supposed to be doing without being able to reconstruct why. There is something in that which points toward what the hunters of Yharnam were actually doing. Not a purpose they chose, but a purpose they were given, and the purpose outlasted the understanding. The infected corpse enemies represent a different category of transformation. These are not people who are becoming beasts. These are people who have died and been animated by something that is not quite life. The distinction matters because it suggests that the scourge of the beast and the cosmic influence of the Great Ones operate through different mechanisms that can produce similar visual results. The infected corpses are not beastly. They are not transformed in the direction of animal. They are simply dead and moving, which is its own kind of wrongness, one that the game places carefully alongside the beast transformations so that the player begins to understand that Yharnam is afflicted in more than one way. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the behaviour of the beasts in the upper cathedral ward and notice that they are not the same as the beasts in the lower city. The scourge beasts in the cathedral area are larger, more developed in their transformation, and significantly more aggressive, but they also seem somehow less distressed. The street-level beasts have that quality of conflict, of something fighting for control. The scourge beasts deeper in the game seem to have resolved that conflict, not in favour of the human, but in favour of the beast. Whether that coherence represents a more advanced stage of the scourge or a different kind of exposure to it is left open, but the behavioural difference is consistent enough to notice. The dogs of Yharnam are a small detail that reveals something large. Bloodborne has dogs. They are not transformed into monsters in the obvious sense, though they are diseased and aggressive. What they show you is that the scourge of the beast and the general environmental contamination of Yharnam are not perfectly separable. The dogs are not undergoing a transformation in the direction of something else. They are simply animals that have been exposed to the same conditions as the humans and have been made more dangerous without being made more complex. The dogs suggest that what the scourge does to humans, it does precisely because humans are the only things complex enough to produce the particular kind of wrongness the game is interested in. The church giants are enemies that often read as set dressing, large obstacles that block progress, rather than creatures with a logic of their own. But the church giants are interesting precisely because of their relationship to the institutions of Yharnam. They serve the church. They appear in church-controlled spaces. They are enormous, and they are dressed in a way that connects them to official Yharnam, rather than to the scourge-afflicted population. One reading of the church giants is that they represent what happens when the church uses the very thing it is supposed to be controlling as a tool for maintaining authority. The way the church giants fight is worth noting. They do not rush. They do not flail. They are methodical in a way that most beast-adjacent enemies are not, which supports the reading that they are not simply lost to the scourge, but are something more deliberately constructed. Whether that deliberateness belongs to them or to the church that placed them there is not settled by the game, and that ambiguity feels intentional. A creature that serves an institution with purpose and cannot be clearly placed on the side of the afflicted or the unafflicted is a specific kind of disturbing, one that is less about the horror of transformation and more about the horror of deployment. The cramped casket enemies in Yharnam are among the most formally strange things in the game. They are not beasts, they are people, apparently still mostly human, who have been sealed inside iron coffins and are attacking you from inside those coffins. The caskets are their weapon and their prison simultaneously. What the game is doing with these enemies is difficult to pin down precisely, but one possible reading is that they represent what happens to people who tried to resist or contain the affliction through literal physical constraint, not on others, but on themselves, and were then swept up into the hunt regardless. The cramped caskets point toward a Yharnam in which the options available to people were so limited that self-imprisonment seemed like a rational response, and that detail lands harder the longer you sit with it. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the behaviour of Yharnam's enemies broadly, and notice that the entire district has a different register of wrongness than the rest of Yharnam. The enemies there are not beastly in the way the upper city's enemies are beastly. They are wrong in a way that is harder to categorize, too coherent to be fully lost to the scourge, and too strange to pass as human. Yhargul is the district most associated with the school of Mensis and with a particular kind of ritual misuse of cosmic contact, and the enemies that populate it seem to reflect that history in their physical and behavioural design. The man-eater boars in the sewers of the cathedral ward are creatures that make a specific kind of ecological argument. They are pigs that have grown enormous, that are clearly diseased, and that appear to have been in those sewers for a very long time. The sewers are their environment now, in a way that suggests they have adapted to it, rather than simply being displaced there. The man-eater boars are not beasts in the scourge sense. They are animals made enormous and hostile by the ambient contamination of a city that has been getting progressively worse for years. They are what Yharnam does to things over time, even when those things are not the specific targets of whatever the scourge is doing. The Yhargul hunters, the hunter enemies you encounter in the unseen village, are distinct from hunter enemies elsewhere, because they are not simply hunters who have been transformed. Someone has been collecting them. Someone with the capacity to gather hunters, and a reason to do so. The Yhargul hunter enemies are evidence of an institutional project that has been underway longer than the events of the game's current night. The school of Mensis needed people for their rituals, needed the resonance that hunters carry, needed something that regular citizens could not provide. The hunters they gathered are still there, still serving a function they may not have consented to. The scale creatures in certain areas of the game are worth noting as an example of transformation that appears to be specifically environmental rather than connected to either the scourge or cosmic influence. These are things that live in places of contamination and have taken on characteristics of those places, armoured against them, adapted to them in ways that are physically evident. The scale creatures suggest that Bloodborne's world has been contaminated for long enough that its local ecologies have produced new forms. Whatever they were originally has been reshaped by what surrounds them. They are environmental horrors rather than either bestial or cosmic ones, and that third category is easy to overlook. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the stone-humped hag enemies in Yhargul and notice that they are not fighters, they are summoners. They summon other enemies rather than engaging directly, which places them in a specific social role even within the distorted hierarchy of Yhargul's afflicted population. The stone-humped hag is a creature that has preserved or developed a kind of leadership function, not physical dominance, but the capacity to direct. Whatever she was before, whatever the scourge has done to her, she has arrived at a state in which her primary interaction with the world is organisational. That is a very specific kind of remaining, and it points toward a Yhargul that has not devolved into pure chaos, but has developed its own distorted social order. The bell-ringing woman enemies are among the most tonally specific enemies in the game. They do not attack you directly. They summon the dead, they ring a bell, and the enemies multiply. The dead are called back. The difficulty of your situation increases purely through their presence. The bell-ringing women are interesting because they represent a version of threat that is entirely mediated, that operates through what they call rather than what they do. Whether they are doing this deliberately, consciously, with some kind of intent, or whether they are simply compulsively ringing a bell because the bell ringing has become their entire mode of existence, is not clear. Both possibilities are disturbing in their own way. The crazed crows that appear in certain areas are small enough that they are easy to dismiss, but they represent something about the ambient horror of the world that the larger enemies cannot convey. The crows have been changed by exposure to something. They attack with a persistence that goes beyond natural animal aggression. They are not simply birds. They are birds that have been touched by whatever has touched everything else in Yharnam, made specifically wrong in a specifically avian way. The crazed crows are useful because they demonstrate that the contamination that produces Bloodborne's creatures is not selective in terms of what it affects. The world itself has gone wrong, and the wrongness extends to the smallest things. The undead amalgam creatures in the deeper areas of the game are bodies that have been fused, that are made of multiple people and multiple forms combined into something that functions as a single creature. The undead amalgams are disturbing because they represent the dissolution of individual identity at the physical level, a point where the question of whose body this was is genuinely unanswerable, because the body is not one person's body anymore. What produces an amalgam is not fully explained, but their presence implies conditions in which individual physical integrity has been so completely undermined that bodies merge rather than transform. This is the scourge at its most extreme, in terms of what it does to the concept of individual identity as expressed in physical form. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the placement of certain beast enemies near objects that suggest what those enemies were before the transformation. Near crafting tools, near books, near weapons that only make sense in the hands of something with more social context than a beast has. And notice that Bloodborne is consistently building biographical suggestions into its creature encounters. The beast in front of the forge was probably a blacksmith. The beast near the medical supplies was probably something like a nurse or a doctor. The beast in the library of the old workshop was probably someone who spent time with books. These are not confirmed. They are the game building an implication structure that rewards the player who looks, not the player who simply fights. The celestial mob enemies, those pale, lurching figures with too many fingers, appear in the Nightmare of Mensis and in certain other late-game areas. They are one of the clearest examples of what the game means by the cosmic transformation. The celestial mob has not become bestial. It has become something that is moving away from the compact, enclosed form of the human body towards something more diffuse, more distributed, less bounded. The extra fingers, the strange proportions, the quality of there being too much of certain things and not enough of others, these are features that suggest a body trying to accommodate more than it was built to accommodate. The street stalker enemies in the earliest parts of the game, those aggressive Yharnamites who pursue you particularly relentlessly through certain narrow passages, are notable not for their design but for their behaviour. They pursue further than other enemies. They do not give up when you put distance between yourself and them. The street stalker's pursuit is disproportionate in a way that suggests something about the specific character of their madness, something more targeted and sustained than the general agitation of the other huntsmen. One possible reading is that they are hunters, people who were involved in the hunt before it collapsed into chaos, whose hunting instinct has survived their descent into something that no longer resembles a hunter. The Pthumerian Watchers in the Chalice dungeons are small but coordinated. They work together. They are the most explicitly pack behaviour enemy in the Chalice dungeon ecosystem, and their coordination suggests something about the civilization that produced them. It was a civilization that understood group tactics, that had developed the kind of social organisation that allows multiple people to do something in concert. Whatever the Pthumerians were, they were not individuals who happened to share a space. They were a people, and the Watchers are the most direct evidence available in the game of what that people looked like when it was operating. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Murgo's attendants and notice that their service is unconditional. They serve regardless of whether the thing they are serving remains what it was. Murgo is an entity they cannot protect, and Murgo's crying is something they cannot stop. But they are still there, still attending, still performing the functions of attendants in a space where those functions have lost whatever meaning they originally had. The attendants suggest that some forms of service persist past the conditions that made them meaningful, and that this persistence is not loyalty. It is something more mechanical and more disturbing, the continuation of a function after the function's purpose has dissolved. The Lauren Silverbeast enemies represent what Bloodborne's world looks like after the process that Yharnam is currently in the middle of has fully concluded. Lauren was a civilization that has already ended. The silver beasts are what is left when a city has finished going through what Yharnam is currently experiencing. They are not in transition, they are at a destination, and that destination is not transcendence. It is the elimination of everything that made the original civilization recognizable, leaving behind creatures that function in a landscape of ruin without any relationship to what the landscape once was. Lauren is Yharnam's future. The Bloodlicker enemies appear in the Hunter's Nightmare and in certain areas of the main game, and they are distinctive because they are creatures defined entirely by their relationship to the substance that has caused most of Yharnam's suffering. The Bloodlickers are attracted to and nourished by blood. They are not beasts and they are not transformed humans. They seem to be something that has emerged from the conditions of the world, as if the sheer presence of so much spilled blood over so many years has produced a creature that feeds on it. The Bloodlickers suggest that the world of Bloodborne has been shaped by its own horror so thoroughly that the horror now produces things that could not exist in a less contaminated environment. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Bloodlickers' placement near old battlefields and sites of heavy violence, and notice that they are drawn specifically to the accumulated, not the fresh. They are not predators following prey. They are something more like scavengers of tragedy, organisms that subsist on the aftermath rather than the event. This places them in a category that Bloodborne does not otherwise populate in the same way. The creature that benefits from the horror rather than suffering from it. The Bloodlickers have found a niche in the ecosystem of catastrophe. And the niche is sustainable because the catastrophe is ongoing. The creatures of the Old Hunters DLC each tell a specific story about what the original hunt was and what it cost the people who conducted it. The infested corpses in the Fishing Hamlet tell the story of a community that was expendable. The shark giants tell the story of what the sea looked like to people who had never seen something like a great one in the water. The Hammersmith enemies tell the story of an industry, a craft, the physical work of maintaining the hunt's tools, made monstrous by whatever the Hamlet's particular contamination was. The DLC is not just more content, it is the prequel to Bloodborne's horror, the part of the story that explains why the horror of the main game exists in the forms it takes. The parasite larva enemies in the DLC area are the most direct evidence in the game that the cosmic infection that affected the Fishing Hamlet operates through a specifically biological mechanism, one that parasitizes hosts and redirects their behavior toward the parasite's purposes. The parasite larvae are not metaphorical parasites, they are literal ones, biological agents that have evolved or been selected to exploit human neurology in the service of whatever the COS adjacent ecosystem requires. This is Bloodborne at its most biological, treating the horror not as a supernatural overlay on a natural world, but as a natural process that simply exceeds human comprehension in scale and consequence. Chapter 3. The Unseen Village and its Inhabitants. The Forbidden Woods is a location that the game presents as a transition point, a place between the familiar horror of the city and something older and stranger that the forest is only beginning to reveal. The enemies you find there are unlike anything in Yharnam proper, and the contrast is not accidental. The Scourge has reached the forest, but the forest was already home to something that predated the Scourge, and the creatures there are products of that layering. You cannot separate what the forest does to people from what was already in the forest when those people arrived. The snake-infested villages of the Forbidden Woods are disturbing in a way that is formally different from the beast transformation that defines most of Yharnam's afflicted. The snakes that emerge from the bodies of these villagers do not seem to be products of the Scourge at all. They seem to be something that was always a possibility within certain bloodlines or certain exposures, something dormant that the conditions of the forest allowed to express itself. The villager body is still present. It has not been consumed or replaced. The snakes simply occupy it additionally, emerge from it, coexist with it in a way that is neither comfortable nor fully hostile. That coexistence is specifically unsettling, because it implies that the body can be a host for something that does not belong to it, without the original inhabitant being removed. The snake villager is still in there, somewhere below the snakes, still animate in the sense of still being what animates the body. The snakes have joined something that is still operating, have taken up residence in a living house. Whatever the snake infestation is, it is not the scourge. The scourge replaces. This adds. The distinction between addition and replacement is one of the most important distinctions in Bloodborne's creature taxonomy. The snake cluster enemies, those enormous writhing masses of serpent bodies that seem to have no human component, represent an extreme version of the same process. They are, by most readings, what the snake infestation looks like when it has progressed past the point where the human host is still legible. The cluster is not a person with snakes in it. It is snakes that have coalesced into something that functions as a creature, that has a kind of unified will, or at least unified behaviour, without having a human centre. The progression from the snake villagers to the snake clusters suggests that what begins as an infestation ends as a replacement, and that detail points towards something about how the game understands the boundary between contamination and transformation. The snake clusters also point toward a question the game raises repeatedly, without answering definitively. At what point does transformation eliminate the person who is undergoing it? The snake villager is at one end of a spectrum. The snake cluster is at the other. Somewhere between those 2 points, the villager ceased to be the most important thing in the picture, and something else took precedence. Where exactly that line is, whether there is a clean line or just a gradient, is something the game refuses to specify, and the refusal is part of the argument. The point at which a person becomes something else is not a line. It is a process, and the process does not mark itself clearly when it has completed. The rabid dogs of the Forbidden Woods are, like their city counterparts, mostly notable for what they tell you by comparison. In the forest, the dogs are larger and faster and more aggressive, but the more significant difference is that they seem to belong there, which the city dogs do not. The city dogs are sick in an urban space. The forest dogs seem like the forest has produced them. This is a small perceptual difference, but it matters, because it suggests that the scourge is not merely spreading outward from Yharnam. The conditions of different environments are interacting with it in different ways, producing creatures that are not simply infected, but specifically adapted to their corrupted context. The Snatchers are enemies that appear in Yharnam and the areas connected to it, and they represent something about what the hunt looks like from the other side. The Snatchers are large, well-equipped, organised figures who are actively kidnapping citizens and taking them somewhere. They are not afflicted. They are not transformed. They are operating with evident purpose, which makes them more threatening in some ways than the beasts, because the beasts are dangerous without agency, and the Snatchers are dangerous with it. What the Snatchers are doing, taking people to Yharnam for the rituals of the School of Mensis, is a horror that does not belong to the category of infection or transformation. It belongs to the category of institutional violence. The Snatchers work at night. They are part of the night of the hunt in a specific way, not as afflicted citizens, but as agents of something that has decided to use the chaos of the hunt for its own purposes. One reading of the Snatchers is that they have always been there, that the School of Mensis has always been taking people for its rituals, and that the hunt makes this easier rather than having caused it. The hunt provides cover. The Snatchers have been operating under that cover for a long time, possibly before the scourge made the city dangerous enough that the disappearance of citizens would go uninvestigated. The Snatchers are the institutional horror making use of the bestial horror, and their coexistence is one of the things that makes Yharnam genuinely complex. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the design of the Snatcher enemy and notice that they are dressed for utility, rather than for either the hunt or for any recognisable social role in Yharnam. They do not look like hunters, and they do not look like citizens. They look like workers doing a specific task, and the task is collection. The Snatchers are the most mundane horror in Bloodborne, people doing their job, a job that involves taking other people away. The horror of the Snatchers is the horror of organised abduction operating in the middle of a city that is too consumed by its own transformation to notice, which is a horror that requires no supernatural elements to be disturbing. The celestial emissaries in their base form before the boss encounter are small enough that you might not register how many of them there are. They populate the upper cathedral ward in a way that is almost decorative, pale figures at the edges of your vision, not immediately threatening, but the density of their presence is itself information. The upper cathedral ward is thick with them, which suggests that whatever process produces celestial emissaries has been operating there for a long time and at significant scale. The small forms you encounter are not isolated anomalies. They are evidence of a population, of a community of transformation, of many people who have reached the same state through the same process. The Winter Lanterns are among the most formally disturbing enemies in Bloodborne, and they are worth treating carefully. They are female figures, with their heads replaced by something that is simultaneously a mass of eyes and a light source, and they drain your insight, which in Bloodborne's mechanics represents your accumulated awareness of the truth of the world. The Winter Lanterns attack your knowledge. They are dangerous not just to your health, but to your capacity to perceive. Whether the eyes on the Winter Lantern's head are her eyes added to her, or eyes she has become, is left genuinely ambiguous. The Winter Lanterns move with a slowness that is at odds with how dangerous they are. They are not trying to catch you, they are simply present, and their presence is what threatens you. The madness build-up they inflict represents something about how the game understands the relationship between perception and sanity. Seeing too clearly, knowing too much, perceiving what should not be perceivable. These things exact costs. The Winter Lanterns are a walking embodiment of that cost. Creatures whose existence demonstrates that some forms of awareness are not survivable in their entirety. The eyes that cover their heads suggest that they can see everything. What they cannot do is look away from what they see. The celestial larvae that appear near the Fishing Hamlet area connect the Delci's coastal horror to the main game's cosmic horror, in a way that suggests the two are not separate events. The larvae are the smallest, most nascent form of something that, at larger scales and after more time, produces the celestial emissaries, and possibly the amygdala. They are the beginning of a process that the game shows you at multiple stages in multiple locations, and what the larvae specifically add to that picture is scale of time. If you encounter larvae in the Hamlet area, which suggests proximity to Kos, and you encounter adult emissaries in the Cathedral Ward, which suggests proximity to the Church's cosmic research, then the cosmic transformation is something that has been happening in Bloodborne's world for longer than any single institution or event could account for. The larvae are very old. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the way the Forbidden Woods connects to Byrgenwerth via the path through the forest, and notice that this path passes through the Snake Villager territory specifically. The route from Yharnam's outer edge to the institution that was responsible for discovering the Old Blood passes through a community of people who have been changed by something that predates and parallels the Old Blood's influence. Byrgenwerth scholars walked through that forest. They saw those villagers. Whether they understood what they were seeing, whether they recognized the snake infestation as a related phenomenon to what they were studying, is something the game does not confirm. But the spatial relationship suggests that Byrgenwerth's researchers were walking past evidence of what their research would produce, possibly for years, before the consequences made themselves fully apparent. The brainsucker enemies are creatures that do to you what the Winter Lanterns do, but through direct physical contact rather than passive presence. They grab you and they drain your insight. They are hostile, where the Winter Lanterns are simply present, predatory, where the winter lanterns are simply dangerous. The brainsuckers are creatures that actively want what you have accumulated, that seek out insight as a resource. This positions them as the opposite of the player character in a specific way. You gain insight through encounter and discovery, and they consume that insight when they encounter you. The brainsuckers are in a sense a reversal of the game's own loop, a creature that takes what the game gives you and removes it. The brainsuckers also suggest something about what insight looks like from the outside, as a substance rather than as a state of awareness. The brainsuckers seem to be able to perceive insight as something material, something they can take. If insight is the accumulated awareness of the true nature of the world, then the brainsuckers are creatures for whom that awareness is food, which raises questions about what they do with it, what it means for a creature to consume another creature's understanding, whether they are sustained by it, whether they gain their own form of perception from it, whether they are simply destroying it because its presence in the world is threatening to something they serve. None of this is answered. The brainsuckers are a question dressed as an enemy. The Cain's servants in the Forsaken Castle Cainhurst are enemies that occupy a specific position in the game's social landscape. Cainhurst was a rival institution to the Healing Church, a noble house with its own relationship to blood and its own practices, and the servants of that house have been changed by those practices in ways that are distinct from the scourge. The Cain's servants are not afflicted. They are not beasts. They are something that persisted through the destruction of their house, maintaining a service relationship to something that is no longer there in any conventional sense. The Cain's servants are the most socially specific enemies in the game, creatures whose identity is entirely defined by who they served and who they continue to serve even in the absence of their masters. Another quiet detail appears when you look at Cainhurst Castle itself and notice that it has been frozen in a specific moment, that the servants are still serving a household that has been destroyed, still setting tables that will never be used, still guarding rooms that no living person inhabits. The castle is a preservation, not of the people who lived there, but of the functions performed for those people, and the Cain's servants are the mechanisms of that preservation. They are the servants after the house has gone, maintaining the house's routines for no one, which is a horror that is not supernatural in its essential character, but simply very old grief made automatic. The celestial mob enemies that appear in the Mensis areas have a specific quality of motion that is worth describing carefully. They do not move quickly or aggressively. They move with the unhurriedness of things that are not significantly concerned with you, that are doing something, and your presence is an interruption rather than a primary concern. The celestial mob is not hunting you, it is doing something else, and you are in the way. This quality of distracted threat is one of the most unsettling things about the late-game cosmic enemies. They are dangerous without being specifically interested in you, and that indifference to your particular presence is more disturbing than malice would be. Malice at least acknowledges you. Indifference suggests you are not the most important thing in the room. The labyrinth madmen in the Chalice dungeons are enemies that represent something about what happens to people who go into the ruins below Yharnam and spend too long there. They are the consumed scholars, the explorers who ventured into the deep structures and were changed by what they found there. The labyrinth madmen are not transformed by the scourge, and they are not ascended through cosmic contact. They are simply destroyed by proximity to something they could not understand, left in a state where understanding is no longer possible, but existence continues. The labyrinth madmen are the cost of the Chalice expeditions, visible and present in the ruins they failed to comprehend. The servant of the goddess enemies connect to a specific moment in the lore, the relationship between the Thumerian civilization and the entity they venerated. The servants are not human, they are not afflicted humans. They are, by most readings, something that was always in that relationship of service, that exists specifically in the context of the goddess they attend. Whatever the Thumerian Great One is, the servants suggest that it has attendants that are not produced by human transformation, that are native to its existence in the way that certain things are native to a particular environment. The servants suggest that the deep lore of Bloodborne includes entities that were never human, that have their own ecosystems and their own hierarchies entirely below the level where the game's human characters operate. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the living string item, which is described as something that comes from the brain of a Great One and which is used in a specific ritual context. And notice that the description implies that Great One biology includes nervous tissue that continues to function independently of whatever constitutes the Great One's body. The living string is evidence that the Great Ones in Bloodborne are not simply large and powerful. They are organised in ways that human biology is not, with components that operate with autonomy, with parts that maintain function even when removed from the whole. The creatures associated with the Great Ones, including the celestial mob and the celestial emissaries, may not be transformed humans at all. They may be components, extensions, or manifestations of the Great Ones themselves, operating through forms that happen to resemble human anatomy. The silver beasts in the Lauren dungeons are faster and more aggressive than almost any other enemy in the Chalice content, and that speed communicates something about what Lauren was and what it became. Lauren was a civilization that passed through something analogous to what Yharnam is currently experiencing, and the silver beasts are what survived that passage. They are not peaceful, they are not resolved. They are the creatures of a catastrophe that completed itself and left these things in its wake. And the things it left are defined by urgency, by speed, by an aggression that is not predatory in any recognisable sense, but simply constant. The silver beasts are always moving, always attacking, always urgent. Whatever Lauren's catastrophe was, it left behind creatures that cannot stop. The undead beasts in the Chalice dungeons are enemies that are simultaneously beasts and undead, occupying both categories at once. They have died, and they are still moving. And they are moving in the form of something that was already at an advanced stage of the Scourge transformation. The undead beasts suggest that death in Bloodborne's world does not interrupt the Scourge. Whatever the Scourge is doing to a body, death does not cancel it. The body continues in its transformed state after the life in it has ended, which means that the Scourge is not dependent on life to operate. It operates through whatever animates things in Bloodborne's deep geography. And that animating force does not distinguish between the living and the dead. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Lauren Dark Beast, one of the most electrically active creatures in the game. And notice that electricity as an element in Bloodborne is consistently associated with the oldest and most powerful versions of the Scourge. The Dark Beast Pile in the main game, the Lauren Dark Beast in the dungeons, the electric properties of certain beast enemies in their enraged states. Electricity in Bloodborne points toward a version of the Scourge that is further from any human origin, more purely itself, more fully expressed. The Lauren Dark Beast is what the Scourge looks like when it has had an entire civilization to work through and has arrived at its furthest expression. It is not a transformed person. It is the Scourge itself, wearing the shape of what used to be a person, the way someone might wear a coat. Chapter 4. The Nightmare and its denizens, the Hunter's Nightmare, is not just a place where difficult enemies appear. It is an argument about what violence does when it is not resolved. The nightmare is populated by hunters who have been trapped there, who are still hunting, who cannot stop, and the environment they are trapped in is saturated with the evidence of what hunting without resolution looks like over what appears to be a very long time. The creatures they have become, or that have formed around them, are products of that particular kind of accumulation. The beastly hunter enemies in the nightmare are hunters who have become what they were hunting. They are armed, they are skilled, they use the tools of the hunt. And they are beasts. The specific horror of the beastly hunter is not the transformation which you have seen by the time you reach the nightmare. but the preservation of competence within the transformation. A beastly hunter is still doing the thing correctly. The technique is still there. Whatever made someone a hunter is still present in whatever they have become. And the result is a creature that is more dangerous than either a human hunter or a beast alone, because it combines the practical knowledge of one with the physical capacity of the other. The beastly hunters suggest that skill is not moral. It persists regardless of what you become. You can become a beast and still know how to fight, which means that the training the hunters received was not a gift that could be revoked by what happened to them. It went into them, and it stayed in them past the point where they were recognizably human. This is disturbing, because it means that the hunt, as a practice, is more durable than the humanity of the people who conduct it. The practice survives what it destroys. The beastly hunters are the most literal evidence of that. The Nightmare Apostles are giant, long-limbed things that move in ways that suggest a specific relationship to the nightmare's space, as if they belong to its geometry, rather than existing within it. Their design is loosely spider-adjacent, and they appear in areas near the orphanage and near places associated with the more cosmic dimensions of the hunter's nightmare. The Nightmare Apostles point toward a reading of the nightmare as not just a psychological space, but a physical one, a place with its own ecosystem, its own creatures, its own logic of inhabitation. The hunters trapped there are the newcomers. The apostles seem to have always been there. The suggestion that the nightmare has native inhabitants is one of the most quietly disturbing implications of the Nightmare Apostles' presence. The nightmare is not simply a space that was constructed to contain hunters. It is a space that already existed, that had its own ecology, and that hunters are being placed into as one of several kinds of inhabitants rather than as the primary population. The Nightmare Apostles are the prior residents, and their presence suggests that the nightmare is something older and larger than the hunt that the healing church conducted. The hunters are trapped there, yes, but they are trapped in something that was already inhabited, which changes the nature of what they are trapped in. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the bloodlickers' placement in the nightmare and notice that they congregate in the areas where the most violence has occurred, near the river of blood that runs through the nightmare, near the remnants of old battles. They are not chasing prey in the way predatory animals chase prey. They are following the evidence of old violence, which is its own kind of disturbing, because it suggests that the violence of the hunt does not disappear when the hunters move on. It persists as nourishment for something else. The aftermath of the hunt feeds the nightmare's ecology. That detail makes the nightmare more coherent as a concept, not just a place where bad things happen, but a place that runs on the accumulated cost of bad things. The parasitic larva enemies are small, fast, and unpleasant, but what makes them interesting is that they appear to be something like the larval stage of a larger process. They suggest growth, development, a life cycle that the game is not fully showing you. The parasitic larva in the context of the hunter's nightmare points toward a reading of the nightmare as a place that is not static, that things are still becoming there, that the processes of transformation that began in Yharnam are continuing in the nightmare without any clear endpoint. The larva's presence implies an adult form, and that implication does its work quietly without being resolved. The winter lanterns in the nightmare appear at moments that feel like punishment for progress. You advance further into the nightmare than anyone should go, and there they are, those slow-moving figures, with their galaxy of eyes, their passive threat accumulating as you try to navigate past them. The winter lanterns in the nightmare are different from the enemies you have been fighting, because they are not interested in stopping you so much as they are interested in the quality of your perception. They find something in the awareness of a hunter that is worth draining, and the nightmare is where that quality is most concentrated, because the hunters in the nightmare have been accumulating experience for a very long time. The mournful eye enemies appear in certain sections of the nightmare and are among the least discussed creatures in the Dielk. They are small, hovering, and they make a sound that is specifically sorrowful in a way that is not typical for enemy design in Bloodborne. Most enemies in the game sound threatening or distressed. The mournful eyes sound grieving. They are not attacking you with malice or fear. They are in a state of loss that has been made physical, that has taken a form, and that form follows you through the nightmare, making a sound that is difficult to listen to without it affecting you emotionally. The mournful eyes are the most emotionally direct enemies in the game, which is not a category that Bloodborne usually works in. The Nightmare Executioners are large enemies in the Nightmare area that bear a resemblance to the Executioners from the main game, but are clearly not the same. The main game's Executioners are connected to the old workshop and to the original hunt. The Nightmare Executioners seem to be a version of that role that has been trapped in the nightmare and has continued to execute there, doing the work of eliminating targets without any context for what those targets are or why they need to be eliminated. The Nightmare Executioners suggest that the nightmare preserves function in the same way it preserves everything else, without the context that made the function meaningful, leaving the action without its reason. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the physical environment of the hunter's nightmare and notice that it contains a version of the workshop. There is a place in the nightmare that resembles the kind of space where hunters were trained, where the tools of the hunt were kept, where the infrastructure of hunting was maintained. The nightmare has preserved this space, which suggests either that the nightmare was shaped by the hunters who were placed in it, that their memories and associations gave it form, or that the nightmare already contained something analogous to a workshop, because the nightmare exists in a specific relationship to the concept of hunting that predates the hunters currently trapped in it. The enemies in the research hall section of the DLC represent a specific horror that connects to institutional medicine and to what happens when the institution loses its ethics entirely. The research hall was a place where the healing church conducted experiments on patients, and the creatures that populate it are those patients, in various stages of a transformation that was not the result of the scourge, but of deliberate experimental intervention. The research hall enemies are horror in the register of medical ethics rather than cosmic or bestial horror. They are what happens when the people responsible for your care decide that your body is a resource. The lumen flower gardeners in the research hall are patients who have developed something in response to their treatment, pale growths that might be flowers or might be something else entirely, and who are watering themselves or their growths or something else in a gesture that is either completely automatic or represents some residual memory of care. The lumen flower gardeners are disturbing because they are doing something that looks like nurturing, tending to something, performing a care function, but the care function is pointed at their own condition rather than at anything external. They are caring for themselves in a context where that care is no longer possible in any meaningful way, but the care itself persists. The Lady Bloods are a related variant in the research hall, and they add a specific quality to the institutional horror of that area. The Lady Bloods are enemies who are clearly women, clearly patients, clearly people who came to the healing church for help and received something else. Their design emphasizes the distance between the vulnerability of seeking medical care and the violence of what was done to them, and navigating the research hall in the context of understanding what it was is a genuinely uncomfortable experience in a way that goes beyond gameplay challenge. The research hall is where Bloodborne is most explicitly critical of the institution at the centre of its horror. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the patient stairwells in the research hall and notice the positions of the patients who are not yet mobile, who are simply in their environments, suspended in states that suggest they have been there for a long time. The research hall is full of patients who did not complete whatever the experiments required, who are frozen in intermediate states, who are evidence of experiments that produced results other than what the church was looking for. The successful transformations went somewhere. The failures stayed. The research hall is a record of failure, and the creatures in it are the proof of how many times the experiment went wrong before anyone stopped doing it. The orphanage enemies in the nightmare are in a building that was, according to available evidence, a place where children with Great One lineage were kept. The enemies in and around the orphanage are not children, which suggests that whatever happened there produced creatures that are no longer recognizable as what they were. The orphanage section of the nightmare is among the most disturbing in the Delk because of what is implied by the building's function and the complete absence of anything that looks like what that building was meant to contain. The orphanage is an empty container that once held something specific, and the things that now occupy the space around it are the aftermath of whatever happened to what it contained. The watchdog of the Old Lords in the Chalice Dungeons is a creature that exists entirely as a mechanism of guardianship, an enormous beast that has been kept in a specific place to prevent access to what is beyond it. The watchdog is not afflicted. It is not transformed in any of the game's named ways. It is a guardian, something created or kept or altered for the specific purpose of blocking passage, and the Chalice Dungeon context places that guardianship in the context of the Pupumerian civilization's relationship to the things it was protecting and the things it was protecting them from. The watchdog is the oldest kind of monster, the thing that stands between you and what lies beyond. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the nightmare's layout over the course of the Dilk, and notice that it mirrors the history of the hunt's founding. You are not just moving through a nightmare, you are moving through a specific sequence of events rendered in physical space, from the initial massacres, to the experimental facilities, to the orphanage, to the lighthouse and the coast. The nightmare has a narrative geography, a layout that tells the story of what the church and its hunters did in roughly the order that it was done. The creatures you encounter at each stage of that geography are the creatures that correspond to that stage of the history. The nightmare is an archive. The Murgo's wet nurse is a creature that appears as a boss in the Nightmare of Mensis, and she is among the most formally strange things the game contains. She is enormous, shrouded, and she is a nurse, a caretaker, attending to the infant that is Murgo. She does not fight you because she wants to hurt you. She fights you because you are a threat to the thing she is caring for. The wet nurse is disturbing not because she is a monster, but because she is a professional, performing a specific care function in a context that has long since passed beyond the point where that function makes any conventional sense. The wet nurse's fighting style is designed around keeping you away from what she is guarding, rather than defeating you as a goal in itself. This distinction between an entity that is trying to destroy you and an entity that is trying to protect something is significant because it places the wet nurse in a moral category that is not available to most of the game's enemies. She is not evil. She is doing her job in a situation where her job has become cosmically entangled in something she may not fully understand. That makes her tragic in a way that most of Bloodborne's bosses are not. The tragedy is not in her nature, but in the persistence of her function past any context that could justify it. The crying of Murgo, which fills the Nightmare of Mensis, is the most ambient piece of creature design in Bloodborne. You hear it before you understand what it is. You hear it while you fight enemies that have nothing to do with Murgo. It is present throughout, a constant in the background of an area that is defined by everything being wrong. The crying of Murgo is the sound of something that needs something, that is in distress, that has been in distress for a long time, and the nightmare's inhabitants, all of them, the celestial mobs and the attendants and the winter lanterns and ultimately the wet nurse, are oriented around that crying without being able to address it. The nightmare is organised around a grief it cannot resolve. Chapter 5, Blood, Eyes and the Transition to Cosmic Horror there, is a shift that happens in Bloodborne about 2/3 of the way through the game, and it is a shift that the creature design reflects before the narrative makes it explicit. The enemies you encounter in the early game are connected to the body, to physical transformation, to the visceral and messy business of one kind of life becoming another. The enemies you encounter later in the game are connected to something else, something that does not have a body in the same way, something that uses bodies as vessels or instruments rather than inhabiting them as homes. This shift is one of the most carefully executed things in the game. The brain of Mensis is not, technically, an enemy you fight in the conventional sense. It is a thing you encounter, a thing that affects you, and eventually a thing you can neutralize. But the encounter with it does not fit the template of combat in the way most of the game's creatures do. The brain is enormous. It is a mass of eyes and neural tissue. It has apparently been the object of ritual attention by the school of Mensis for a very long time, and it drains your insight simply by being present. The brain of Mensis is one of the most formally ambitious things Bloodborne attempts, because it is a creature whose threat is entirely epistemic. The brain of Mensis does not hurt you by attacking you. It hurts you by being something that you cannot fully perceive without that perception costing you something. This inverts the usual relationship between player and enemy in a way that is specifically philosophically significant. You do not encounter the brain and decide how to fight it. You encounter the brain and experience what it costs to be near it. The brain is the game's most explicit statement about what the endgame cosmic horror actually means. It is not a thing you defeat so much as a thing whose presence demonstrates the limits of what the human perspective can accommodate. The celestial emissaries are late-game enemies that appear in the upper cathedral ward, and they are worth looking at carefully because they represent the closest the game comes to showing you what a successful transition toward Great One contact looks like from the inside. The emissaries are small, blue, vaguely humanoid things that move with a lightness that nothing human has in Bloodborne. They are not threatening in the way the beasts are threatening. They are threatening in the way something is threatening when you do not fully understand what it is or what it wants. The emissaries in their smaller form are almost gentle. In their larger, summoned boss form, the emissaries expand into something that is clearly beyond human scale. But the expansion feels like a reveal rather than a transformation, as if the small form was always only a portion of what they were. The celestial emissaries point toward a reading of Great One contact as something that does not destroy the human who undergoes it so much as it reveals that the human was never the whole of what was there. This is a fundamentally different model of transformation than the beast transformation, which takes something recognizable and makes it unrecognizable. The cosmic transformation reveals that the recognizable part was a surface. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the environment of the upper cathedral ward and notice that it has been prepared. The space has been arranged for something. The objects and the layout and the lighting all suggest a place that is waiting for an event rather than a place where people live. The celestial emissaries are in a prepared space, which implies that whatever they are, someone or something was expecting them. That preparation is more disturbing than anything the emissaries themselves do, because it suggests a degree of intention and foresight that the game does not assign to any visible human actor in the cathedral ward. The amygdala is visible from early in the game if you have enough insight to see it, which is the first indication that the creatures of Bloodborne's cosmic register do not become present as the game progresses. They were always present, you just were not able to see them. The amygdala clings to the outside of buildings. It is enormous. It does not move to attack you unless you attack it first or venture into a specific space it controls. What the amygdala is doing there, on the outside of the cathedral buildings, what function it serves in the ecology of Yharnam that most citizens cannot perceive, is not fully explained. One possible reading is that the amygdala are a kind of infrastructure for whatever the Great Ones are doing in Yharnam, present not as invaders, but as participants in something that has been underway for longer than the city has existed. They are not attacking Yharnam. They are part of Yharnam in a layer that most of Yharnam does not have access to. The amygdala's size makes this reading uncomfortable, because it places something enormous at the centre of a city without anyone who lives there being able to perceive it. The city's citizens have been living inside something they cannot see for their entire lives, and that particular form of blindness is one of Bloodborne's central images. The lesser amygdala that serve as gatekeepers in the nightmare areas are a related but distinct creature, and the distinction matters. The amygdala on the buildings of the main game feels like a native presence, something that belongs to the deeper layer of the world. The lesser amygdala in the nightmare feels like a mechanism, something that has been placed to serve a function in a constructed space. Whether that distinction is intentional or whether I am reading too much into a practical design difference is genuinely uncertain, and I want to name that uncertainty rather than smooth over it. The eye collector enemies in the nightmare are humanoid figures who carry jars of eyes, and they are disturbing in a specific way that connects them to the game's recurring interest in what it costs to see clearly. In Bloodborne, insight, the game's measure of how much you understand about the true nature of the world, is treated as a resource with costs attached to it. Gaining insight makes things harder in certain mechanical ways. The eye collectors are collecting something that the game has established as dangerous to possess. They are hoarding awareness, which is either a form of greed or a form of service to something that needs what awareness provides. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the eye collector's jars and consider that they are not simply collecting eyes. They are preserving them. The jars suggest that the eyes have value in a form that requires preservation, which implies that the value is not just symbolic, but practical, that the eyes in those jars are being kept for a purpose that requires them to remain viable. What that purpose is connects to the broader economy of insight and perception in Bloodborne, to the way certain things in the world trade in awareness as a currency. The eye collectors are participants in that economy, and their activity points toward a network of entities for whom human perception is a resource to be extracted and maintained. The Witch of Hemwick and the ritual space she inhabits connect the mid-game to the cosmic register in a way that is easy to miss, because the witch is primarily understood as a boss encounter rather than as a piece of world building. But the invisible hands she summons, those grasping presences that have no visible form, are among the most formally strange things in the mid-game. They are something that has no body in any visible sense, that interacts with the physical world through touch alone. The invisible hands suggest that whatever the witch was practicing before the scourge reached her was already connecting her to things that do not have bodies in the normal sense, and that connection has outlasted whatever she was as a person. The Labyrinth Sage enemies in the Chalice dungeons are creatures that are specifically associated with wisdom, with the kind of deep study that the Chalice dungeon explorers would have pursued. They are not simply beasts. They are entities that retain something of the intellectual engagement of their prior existence, that are still oriented toward knowledge, even though the form of that orientation has become monstrous. The Labyrinth Sages suggest that the pursuit of knowledge in Bloodborne's world is not simply dangerous because of what it leads to, but because of what it does to the person who pursues it. That the engagement with certain ideas over enough time changes the person engaging with them in ways that are physically visible. The celestial lava enemies in the final areas of the main game are a version of something you have seen earlier, but their placement matters enormously. They appear near the endgame boss, near the entity that the entire game has been building toward, and their presence there suggests that whatever transformation they are in the early stages of is the same transformation that has been operating at every scale throughout the game. The celestial larvae near the end of the main game are the smallest things in the vicinity of the largest, and the scale difference between them makes both more significant, the smallest beginning of a process that, at its largest expression, is incomprehensible. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the behaviour of the celestial emissaries during their boss encounter, and notice that they do not seem to be fighting you in the way most bosses fight you. They are reacting to you as an intrusion into something that was already happening. something that does not require your absence to continue, but would prefer it. The boss encounter with the celestial emissaries is one of the few in Bloodborne where the boss does not feel like it was waiting for you. It feels like you arrived at the wrong moment and interrupted something, and the thing you interrupted is continuing around you while you fight. Visible in the cosmic architecture of the space, if you take a moment to look at it, rather than at what is trying to hurt you. The Garden of Eyes enemies in the Chalice dungeons are worth looking at specifically because they are the most direct visualization in the game of what the relationship between human anatomy and the collection of eyes looks like. They are humanoid. They have eyes where eyes should not be, distributed across the face and body in a way that looks less like a design and more like a condition, like the eyes arrived and took up residence rather than being placed. The Garden of Eyes points toward a version of the cosmic transformation that is specifically about seeing, about the accumulation of the capacity to perceive more than a single human body was designed to perceive. The long-armed centipede gent and its variants are late-game enemies that represent something about what the body can become when the rules governing its form have dissolved entirely. The centipede gent is not a person who has become centipede-like. It is something that has too many limbs distributed in a way that no evolutionary pressure would have produced. That exists as a collection of arms arranged around a central form in a pattern that looks like it was generated by a logic that is not biological. The centipede gent suggests that past a certain point of transformation, the body stops following any rules at all. The living failures are a boss encounter that represents something philosophically interesting, a group of failed ascension attempts that have been collected in a space, and that, collectively, still have enough residual capacity to constitute a threat. The living failures are not one failed transformation. They are many, accumulated in a single encounter, and the encounter itself seems to be a representation of the sheer volume of people who tried something and did not fully achieve it. What they tried, what they failed at, and what remained after the failure is the substance of the encounter, and what it suggests is that the transformation the late game of Bloodborne is interested in is not a reliable process. It fails often. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the living failures' attack patterns and notice that they are trying to do something. They are not simply attacking you. They are still attempting the thing they attempted when they were alive, attempting to cool something down, or summon something, or reach something, and they are still failing, still incomplete, still stuck in the moment of their failure, without any apparent capacity to move past it. The living failures suggest that failed transformation does not resolve into something different. It fixes itself in the moment of failure, and continues there indefinitely. The One Reborn is a creature made of multiple bodies that has been assembled into a single functional entity for a purpose that connects to the school of Mensis' rituals. It is not a natural formation. It is a construction made deliberately from available materials in service of something the game does not fully explain. The One Reborn is the most explicit example in Bloodborne of a creature that was built rather than transformed, that represents the application of intelligence to the horror rather than the horror producing its own forms spontaneously. Someone made the One Reborn, and the making of it is as disturbing as its existence. The presence of kin enemies in the later parts of the game establishes a category of creature that connects to Great One biology in a way that is explicitly named in the game's item descriptions. Kin are things that are connected to the Great Ones either by lineage, by exposure, or by a process of becoming that has moved them out of the category of beast and into the category of something else. The kin enemies suggest that the Great Ones have an ecology around them, that their existence generates a certain kind of creature in the spaces they occupy, and that the creatures generated are shaped by proximity to something that operates by rules fundamentally different from the rules that govern the rest of the world. Being near a Great One, for long enough, changes what you are. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Rom, the vacuous spider, and notice that she is specifically described as vacuous. which in this context means not empty, but having been emptied, having had something removed. Rom was a scholar at Bergenworth. She crossed a line and became something, and what she became is enormous and strange and surrounded by small spider forms that move with the same quality of absence that she embodies. Rom's transformation was specifically a transaction. She gave up something in exchange for becoming what she is. What she gave up, the game suggests, is the capacity for meaningful comprehension, the vacancy being precisely the absence of whatever understanding would make her experience of her current existence coherent. The vacuous spider is the most philosophical name for an enemy in Bloodborne, and the philosophy it encodes is very dark. Chapter 6, Old Yharnam and the Archaeology of Catastrophe. Old Yharnam is the version of the city that has already finished what the current city is in the middle of doing. It was burned to prevent the scourge from spreading, and the burning did not work entirely, because you can go there and it is still active, still full of creatures that are still doing what they were doing when the fire came. Old Yharnam is a preservation of catastrophe, a place where the past has not passed, and its creatures are the most direct evidence of what Bloodborne's horror looks like when it has been given full room to develop. The beast enemies in Old Yharnam are more fully transformed than anything in the upper city. They have moved further from any recognisable human form, which means that if the reading of the scourge as a process is correct, Old Yharnam is showing you a later stage. But the unsettling thing about Old Yharnam is not the advancement of the transformation, it is the stillness. These creatures have been down there, in that burned quarter of the city, for a very long time. They have not resolved into anything. They have not arrived anywhere. They are still transforming, still in the middle of a process that has had decades or longer to complete, and that has not completed. The scourge does not end. It continues. The blood-starved beast is a boss that belongs to this chapter in spirit, even if its physical location is technically above Old Yharnam proper. It is what happens when the transformation has gone so far and the deprivation has gone so long that what remains is barely coherent. The blood-starved beast is not a beast that has completed its transformation. It is a beast that has been starving in its transformation for so long that the transformation itself has become grotesque, a body that is almost nothing, that has consumed itself in the process of becoming. The blood-starved beast's skin tears as it fights. Its own body is coming apart during the encounter. The fight with the blood-starved beast feels less like a battle and more like a mercy that neither of you can acknowledge as such. The creature in front of you is suffering in a way that combat cannot address, that defeating it cannot resolve, because the suffering is constitutional rather than situational. The blood-starved beast is not in pain because of you. It is in pain because of what it is. You can end the fight. You cannot end the pain. That distinction is part of what makes the encounter memorable, even for players who have never thought about it in these terms. The combat is successful, but the situation does not resolve. The Old Yharnam beasts make a specific noise that is different from the beasts in other parts of the game. There is something in that sound that is not rage and not fear. It is something older and more continuous. It is the sound of something that has been doing the same thing for a very long time and has no other register available to it. The sound design of Bloodborne is generally excellent, but the Old Yharnam beasts are a particular achievement because they communicate something about duration and exhaustion that the visual design alone could not convey. What you are hearing is the sound of something that has been a monster for so long it has forgotten the word for what it was before. Jura, the hunter who guards Old Yharnam from the tower, is not a creature in the technical sense. He is a human, an old hunter who has stopped hunting. But his presence in Old Yharnam and his stated relationship to the beasts below him is one of the most important pieces of interpretive context the game offers for how to understand those beasts. Jura says that the beasts were once people, which is something the game implies throughout, but rarely states. He has decided, based on that recognition, to stop killing them. He is protecting the things that destroyed the city he is standing in, not because he does not understand what they are, but because he does. Jura's perspective does not resolve the question of what the right response to the beasts is, but it introduces the question formally, and once it is introduced, you cannot walk through Old Yharnam the same way. The beasts below him were people. Some of them may have been people he knew. They are past the point where that matters to how they interact with the world, but it has not stopped mattering to him. Jura is the only character in the game who has decided that the recognition of what something was is sufficient reason to protect what it has become, and whether that is wisdom or something else is left entirely for the player to determine. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the architecture of Old Yharnam and notice that there are structures that are intact below the burn line. The fire did not consume everything. There are buildings in Old Yharnam that have survived in reasonable condition, which means that whatever is living in them, whatever is still active in that quarter, has been living in those buildings for the duration. The beasts of Old Yharnam are not wandering in rubble. They are inhabiting buildings. They are, in whatever remains of the sense of the word, residents. Old Yharnam is not an abandoned city. It is an occupied city. The question of what the beasts of Old Yharnam have been doing in those buildings, what constitutes the daily existence of a creature that is past the point of human cognition but still physically present in human spaces, is not answered by the game. But the question is implicit in the design. Something lives in those buildings. Something moves through those streets. Whatever the beasts have organised themselves around in the years since the fire, if they have organised themselves at all, is a version of inhabitation that the game does not allow you to see, because to see it you would have to watch from a distance without threatening anyone, and Bloodborne is not structured to give you that kind of time. The beasts of Old Yharnam have a daily existence the game cannot show you, and that invisible existence is part of what makes them feel real rather than placed. The small celestial larvae that appear in certain areas near the Healing Church's more esoteric operations are creatures that have no clear parallel in the bestiary of the Scourge. They are not beastly, they are not fully human. They are pale, and they move in clusters, and they seem drawn towards sources of arcane energy. The small celestial larvae suggest that the cosmic infection that the Healing Church was working with was reaching deeper into the city than the Church presented. The Scourge was the visible crisis. The cosmic contamination was the less visible one. The labyrinth rat enemies in the Chalice dungeons are interesting because they represent one of the clearest examples of the game's world building through creature design working in the negative space. Rats are rats. They are not transformed. They are not cosmically touched. They are just rats, living in the ruins of a civilization that predates Yharnam by what appears to be a significant amount of time. The labyrinth rats are a reminder that not everything in the game is symbolic, that the subterranean world has its own mundane ecology that existed before the Scourge and that will probably continue after it. They are also, incidentally, a useful calibration point for scale. The Chalice Dungeon undead giants are creatures that represent something about the institutional history of the world that precedes Bloodborne. They are giants who have been bound, restrained in some cases, and are still hostile after what appears to be a very long time. The undead giants in the Chalice dungeons suggest that the institutions that built those dungeons were doing things with large, powerful entities that required restraint. What those things were is not fully explained, but the evidence of restraint, the chains, the cages, the integration of the giants into the architecture of the dungeons themselves, points toward a civilization that was in the business of controlling things that did not want to be controlled. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the physical restraints on the undead giants in the Chalice dungeons, and notice that those restraints are built into the dungeon architecture. The restraints are not portable. They were not added after the fact. They were built in when the dungeons were constructed, which means that whoever built these dungeons knew, before they finished building them, that they would need to restrain something enormous. The dungeons were designed around the giants from the beginning. The undead giants are not prisoners who ended up there. They were placed there deliberately, as part of the dungeon's original function. And whatever that function was, it required something enormous to remain in place indefinitely. The Pthumerians themselves are the most direct connection to whatever civilization preceded Yharnam, and the Pthumerian enemies you encounter in the Chalice dungeons are the closest the game comes to showing you what that civilization's population looked like. They are tall, thin, and they fight with a precision that suggests skill rather than transformation. The Pthumerians are not beasts. They are not cosmically dissolved. They are simply the representatives of a civilization that practiced certain things and paid certain costs for those practices, and they are still there, in the ruins of their city below Yharnam, still doing what they were doing. The fact that you can fight the Pthumerians and kill them does not resolve the question of what they were or what they were doing. It just means you passed through where they were. The Pthumerians resist you because you are in their space, not because they recognize you as a specific kind of threat. You are an intruder in a place that has been sealed from the world above for a very long time, and the Pthumerians respond to your presence the way any organized people would respond to an uninvited presence in their territory. They fight you. But they are not monsters. They are the survivors of something, still operating in the ruins of their civilization, still organized enough to resist intrusion, and what they are surviving is the same general category of catastrophe that Yharnam is currently experiencing at a much smaller scale. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Pthumerian descendant enemy and notice that it fights with a grace that none of the other Chalice dungeon enemies possess. The Pthumerian descendant is elegant, it is precise, it moves like someone who was trained, not like something that was made. That elegance is disturbing in the context of everything around it, because it reminds you that the deepest layers of Bloodborne's world were built by people who were, by some measures, more sophisticated than the people of Yharnam. The horror of the Chalice dungeons is not the horror of a culture that collapsed into barbarism. It is the horror of a culture whose sophistication led it somewhere that sophistication should not have gone. The Watchers in the Chalice dungeons have a quality of organised purpose that is distinct from the mindless aggression of the scourge-afflicted enemies in the main game. They move in coordinated ways. They respond to each other's positions. They fight as a unit rather than as individuals who happen to be occupying the same space. The Watchers' coordination suggests that whatever civilizational structure the Pthumerians maintained has been preserved in some form in the dungeons, that the remnant population in the ruins still operates according to organizational principles that were set down when the civilization was active. The Watchers are not survivors who have reverted to instinct. They are survivors who have maintained something. The Labyrinth Madmen are a counterpoint to the Watchers, where the Watchers suggest organised survival, the Madmen suggest collapse. They are the explorers who came down into the Chalice dungeons and could not maintain themselves in the presence of what they found. The Labyrinth Madmen are a record of failed scholarship, of people who sought the knowledge the dungeons contained and were destroyed by it rather than educated by it. They are in the same space as the Watchers, occupying the same ruins, and the contrast between the organised remnant civilization and the dissolved human scholars it has outlasted says something about whose knowledge this was and who it was designed to survive. The fluorescent flower enemies in certain Chalice areas are creatures that do not appear in the main game at all, that belong entirely to the deep ecology of the Chalice dungeon world. They are not Pthumerian. They are not transformed humans. They are plant-adjacent entities that seem to have evolved or been generated in the specific environmental conditions of the deep dungeons, conditions that are not replicated anywhere on the surface. The fluorescent flowers are what you find when you go deep enough that the world above no longer provides the relevant reference points. They are native to a depth that human beings were not designed to reach, and their existence is evidence that the world below Yharnam is genuinely its own world, rather than simply an extension of the world above. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the layout of the deepest chalice dungeons and notice that they are not built in the style of Yharnam or even in the style of the shallower Pthumerian ruins. They feel older, more deeply embedded in the geological substrate of the world, less constructed and more grown into the stone. Whatever made the deepest parts of the chalice dungeon world did not build in the way the Pthumerians built. It occupied, organised, inhabited, but not in the architectural sense that the shallower ruins reflect. The creatures that live in those deepest sections are products of that different kind of inhabitants, things that belong to a place that was never designed for human occupation, and that reflect in their forms the logic of a very different relationship to the physical world. Chapter 7. Creatures of the Sea and the Stars there is a body of water in Bloodborne that you never see directly, but that the game implies persistently. The Fishing Hamlet was a coastal community. The Great Wunkos was found in the sea, or in something that resembled the sea. The creatures associated with the DLC content are marked by their relationship to things that come from deep water, and deep water is, in the geography of horror, a very specific kind of unknown. It is the dark below the dark, the place that has no light and no visibility and no landmarks, and the things that live there are shaped by the absence of those things. The fishermen of the Fishing Hamlet are not beasts. They are people who have been changed by proximity to Kos for so long that the change has become complete and permanent. But the change is not the same as the Scourge's change. The fishermen have not become animals in the way the Yharnamites have become animals. They have become something more specifically aquatic, something that is adapted to a different environment than the one their ancestors lived in, even though they are still, evidently, living on land. The fishermen represent a transformation that is about adaptation rather than degradation. The distinction between adaptation and degradation is one that Bloodborne generally does not make available, because most of its transformations are clearly degradations, clear losses of something that was valuable. The fishmen complicate that reading. They have lost their human form, but they have gained something in the direction of whatever Kos was. And whatever Kos was is not simply a monster. The Kos that the game shows you is enormous and strange and clearly powerful, but there is something about it that is not straightforwardly threatening in the way a beast is threatening. The fisherman's transformation takes them towards something that was, in its own context, extraordinary. Whether that makes their transformation less awful is a question the game refuses to settle. The relationship between the fisherman and the physical space of the Fishing Hamlet is one of the most carefully constructed things in the DLC. They are still in the village. They are still doing things that resemble what you do in a village, moving between structures, being present in the spaces that were built for human habitation. They have not left. Whatever happened to them has not severed their relationship to the place they lived. That persistence is important because it complicates the reading of their transformation as simple loss. They lost their human form. They did not lose their attachment to home. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the hamlet's geography and notice that it has a shrine. Someone built that shrine. Someone maintained it. The shrine in the Fishing Hamlet is dedicated to Kos, or to the idea of Kos, or to whatever the Fishing Hamlet's people understood Kos to be, which was probably not what the hunters of Yharnam understood Kos to be when they came and took what they found there. The shrine points toward a community that had a theology, a relationship to the thing that was changing them, that was not simply suffering. The Fishing Hamlet's people were not just victims of cosmic exposure, they were practitioners of a relationship to it. The hunters interrupted that relationship violently and incompletely. They came, killed, took, and left. The fishermen and their hamlet are the aftermath of that interruption. People whose relationship to something sacred was violated by outsiders who wanted what the sacred thing contained rather than what it meant. The creatures of the Fishing Hamlet are not simply transformed. They are wronged. Their transformation is connected to a violation, and the violence of that violation is part of what gives the hamlet its distinctive emotional register, a place that is not just horrifying, but grieving, whose horror and grief have become so entangled that they produce the same creatures. The shark giants of the Fishing Hamlet are among the most visually arresting enemies in Bloodborne. And what makes them interesting is that they are not fishmen. They are not transformed village inhabitants. They are something else. Something that seems to be native to the coastal area, or at least to the presence of Kos. Something that exists in a different ecological relationship to the hamlet than the fishmen do. The shark giants are not local people made monstrous. They are locals of a different kind. Creatures that were always there, or that arrived with Kos, or that emerged from the conditions that Kos created in that stretch of water. The shark giants make the hamlet a more complex place, not just a transformed human community, but a place that has attracted or produced multiple kinds of inhabitant. The brain fluid parasites that are associated with the DLC area are creatures that work through other organisms rather than inhabiting a body of their own. They are the most clearly parasitic things in Bloodborne, and what makes them interesting in the context of the game's broader concerns is that they represent a model of corruption that is specifically about control rather than transformation. A parasite does not change its host into something else. It redirects the host's behaviour toward the parasite's purposes. The brain fluid parasite suggests that there is a version of the Bloodborne horror that is not about what you become, but about who is directing you when you move. This is a different category of loss than the Scourge produces. The Scourge changes what you are. The parasite leaves what you are intact, but takes the controls. The result looks similar from the outside, a person doing something they would not otherwise do, doing it in a way that serves something other than themselves. But the mechanism is different, and the mechanism matters for understanding what Bloodborne is saying about the different forms of losing yourself. The sandworms that appear in certain chalice dungeons are creatures that suggest something about what the deep structures of Bloodborne's world contain that the surface never reveals. They are enormous, and they are old, and they function in a space that has been sealed from the surface world for a very long time. The sandworms are not transformed humans. They are not affected by the Scourge. They are native to whatever the chalice dungeons were before human beings began digging into them, and their presence implies that the world of Bloodborne has layers of ecology that the story never touches directly. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the scale of the sandworms relative to the dungeon passages they occupy, and notice that the passages are sized for them. The Thumerian ruins did not simply contain passages that sandworms moved into. The passages seem to be built to accommodate them, which suggests that the relationship between the Thumerian civilization and the sandworms was not one of coexistence in the sense of two things sharing a space. It was a designed relationship, an architecture built around the existence of very large creatures as part of the original plan. The sandworms were not pests that moved in, they were inhabitants that were accounted for when the space was built. The fluorescent flowers and the Garden of Eyes in the deepest chalice sections represent an ecology that has developed independently of any of the named factions or events in Bloodborne's history. They are not Thumerian remnants, and they are not Scourge products, and they are not cosmic entities in the Great One's register. They are things that live in the deep world, because the deep world has its own conditions and its own logic, conditions and logic that were present before anyone came to study them. The fluorescent flowers and the Garden of Eyes are the deep world's native fauna, shaped by an environment that is not a corrupted version of the surface environment, but a fundamentally different one. The creatures of the Chalice dungeons collectively make an argument that the world of Bloodborne is much older than the history of Yharnam suggests, and much stranger in its deep structures than the city's institutions were equipped to understand. The Thumerians who first explored those depths were not the first beings to inhabit them. The schools that sent scholars down to retrieve knowledge from the ruins were not sending them into something they could fully comprehend. The creatures that appear in the deepest sections are the evidence of that incomprehensibility, the residue of processes and ecologies that have no equivalent in the world the scholars came from. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Ailing Loran chalice and the greater Pethumaru Ihel chalice, and notice that the creatures in the highest level ritual dungeons are qualitatively different from those in the entry-level ones. The difficulty increases, yes, but the nature of what you encounter also shifts. The enemies in the deepest ritual dungeons are not simply stronger versions of what you met at the beginning. They are different things that belong to a different stratum of the dungeon world, and encountering them feels like arriving somewhere genuinely new rather than passing through a difficulty gate. The dungeon system is not just a ladder, it is a descent into something that does not have equivalents at the levels you started from. The eyeballs and the vermin, items that are associated with specific aspects of Bloodborne's deeper lore, are not enemies in the conventional sense, but they are creatures in the broader sense. Organisms that inhabit the world and are connected to things the game treats as significant. The vermin in particular, those tiny worm-like things that hunters crush after successful Carol rune interactions, are described as things that lurk in the blood of those who have succumbed to beasthood, invisible to most eyes. The vermin are creatures that exist at the absolute edge of perception, things that you would never encounter without specific ritual context. And their existence implies a world that is populated at scales and in registers that ordinary perception cannot access.